So by now, we've, of course, all seen the devastating images and video footage of the fires in the West, from Washington, Oregon, down to California, and points further east have been decimated as well. Even here on the East Coast, the haze from all of those fires has actually been visible.
That's right. So according to a recent piece in The Atlantic, there was at least one warning sign prior to these conflagrations. So here to talk about what that was is the staff writer for The Atlantic and a journalism fellow over at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, Robinson Meyer. Robinson, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So, Robinson, tell us about the circumstances which led to this fire. Obviously, climate change has something to do with it. I've also read extensively about fire management in the state of California and how they have basically set themselves up for something like this, which a lot of people don't want to talk about. Lay out the whole picture of what is going on out west right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is really, there was a perfect firestorm, as a source told me, that went on, that went into making these fires happen. Absolutely, we had weather conditions that would always kind of lead to a big fire event, these kind of offshore winds that turn the big valleys in California and the Pacific Northwest basically into blowtorches. We have, as you mentioned, we have this history in California and across the West of fighting every single fire basically for the last century, even though the environment itself is kind of grown to burn, it's supposed to burn, and we've now fought so many fires that there's this buildup of fuel. And the last element here, and the subject of my piece, is that this was an exceptionally hot summer. It was hot, and that made it so that it was dry too. And so there's this indicator that fire scientists look at called the vapor pressure deficit, which basically measures how thirsty the air is. And even before any of the fires started, the vapor pressure deficit in California was at an all-time high in August. So the atmosphere was extremely thirsty. It was sucking tons of moisture out of the vegetation, and that really primed the forest to burn.
Wow. And so how did these fires this year compare to what we've seen? I mean, I remember last year was a horrible fire season as well. Do things just continue to seem to get worse and worse and worse? Or is this truly an aberration and may revert back to normal, a more normal next year?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's kind of two ways of answering that question, and it actually goes into what we were just talking about. So this is the largest acreage year on record in California. So 1 in every 33 acres in California has burned this year. I think it's more than 3 million acres. 2018 was the last big fire year in California in terms of, that was when the Camp Fire happened. That was when we were kind of dealing with a similar size of news event. In 2018, it was big news that 6 of the 10 biggest fires on record in California had happened in the past decade. So today, 6 of the 10 biggest fires on record in California have happened since 2018, and 5 of them are burning right now.
Wow.
So it is huge. At the same time, it is also true that it seems like huge swaths of California used to burn before we got there, millions of acres a year before white folks got there, right? Millions of acres a year. And that was a very common, normal occurrence. The difference between that, what we think happened then and what we know is happening now, is that then it was a lot of smaller fires. The state burned more regularly, and so there was less to burn. What's happening now is that every fire is becoming extremely intense and huge. And we think that has to do with the extreme temperatures we saw over the summer and this extremely high vapor pressure deficit, which is tied to climate change.
Mm-hmm. So, Robinson, tell us what can actually be done about this. Are there, is there better forest management? Is there some technology that we're not employing? I actually read that there could, fire retardants and making sure that you're suppressing fires is actually a huge industry in California because a lot of people don't want to allow some controlled burns. What could be done? Is it a multifaceted approach? What's going on?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a few different things that we could do. First is absolutely letting these fires burn if they're remote and if they happen in the spring or late fall. If they're not going to threaten anyone, then to some degree we kind of need to clear that fuel out of there and they could burn. The second is that, yes, there is like a kind of massive, there's a massive amount of work to be done. It's not quite raking the forest, but like the U.S. could send in thousands of people over a huge area over a long period of time and try to clear out a lot of the fuel that kind of contributes to these massive fires. But the key thing is that you have to take the fuel away, because if you just cut it down and then leave it in the forest, it will just burn even more intensely. Then lastly, I would say the innovations are probably less in like firefighting technology than in fire adapting technology. So we could run more power lines underground that would reduce the number of ignitions caused by kind of our electricity infrastructure. We could change how houses are made. You know, one thing that a former firefighter suggested to me this week was that if we put metal roofs on a lot of houses sitting out in the forest, it would actually really reduce the kind of destructive power of the fires themselves. Because what's happening, for instance, in Oregon is like you get these hot embers that kind of arrive in advance of the fire. And if they land on a dry roof or a roof covered in leaves or needles, then it just goes up. But if you have maybe a metal or more flame retardant roof, then the house might not burn.
And what
there are some options, yeah.
What about, obviously, when your community has been destroyed, the first thing you want is to be able to regroup, be able to rebuild, right? Be able to go back to that community for your neighbors to be safe and have their homes rebuilt and the community come back to life. But in some of these communities that are facing increasing threat from fires, is there any thought about, do we rebuild or how do we rebuild? I mean, these are sort of like gut-wrenching conversations and decisions. What does that conversation look like right now?
Yeah, I mean, it will depend on a few things. So absolutely, these are conversations that communities have faced. They're conversations that were faced in Paradise, California, after that city burned down. We still really don't understand the scale of the destruction in Oregon. It depends. I mean, often these communities want to come back to some degree. What winds up affecting it is that, to be blunt, home insurance. So,
right.
You buy your home for 30 years, but you renew your home insurance every year. And in some parts of the state, at least in California, home insurers are really backing out of the market. They would prefer not to insure anything, and the state's taken some actions to try to keep them there, but it can't really work forever. And so what starts to happen is like people would like to live in places and no one will insure them, and that means they can't hold a mortgage. And so that, I think, is interfering with kind of people's ability to decide to stay or leave as much as anything else.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Robinson, thank you so much. We're really glad to have your insights today.
Thanks, Robinson.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Next on Rising, Congressman Raul Grijalva. He's calling for a total ban on corporate lobbyists. Friend of the show, Ryan Grimm, he's going to weigh in on that proposal for Joe Biden when Rising returns.